iGlobenews brings global views.
I would like to welcome our listeners to another edition of iGlobenews Pods. If you like our podcasts and want to stay in touch, please subscribe to our channel and our newsletter. You can find all our podcasts, including this one, our articles, and our audio articles on our website at www.iglobenews.org. Joining us for today's interview is Professor Nicolas Stockhammer. He is an internationally recognized expert on terrorism and extremism. Let me quickly start by introducing you to our audience. Professor Nicolas Stockhammer is a political scientist specializing in security policy and terrorism research. Since July 2021, you have been the scientific director and coordinator of the research cluster Counterterrorism, Countering Violent Extremism and Intelligence at the Department of Law and International Relations at the Danube University Krems in Lower Austria. You have published widely and have made numerous national and international media appearances on issues on transnational terrorism, extremism, and politically motivated violence. Welcome, Professor Stockhammer, to our show.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let me start by asking a question which has been in the news of late. On 13th of January, a Syrian who defected to Germany was held accountable for his crimes committed in Syria by a German court in Koblenz. The German court claimed universal jurisdiction, a concept from international law which holds that a national court may prosecute individuals for serious crimes against international law, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and torture, based on the principle that such crimes harm the international community or international order itself, which states individually may act to protect. The German ruling was the first such proceeding in the world linked to abuses committed by Bashar al-Assad's regime. So my questions to you are, what are the implications of this verdict, not only against Syrians, but also against others who flee a country after committing crimes against humanity? And do you see countries following Germany's example by invoking this principle and prosecuting terrorists through their national court system?
I think this is a very important verdict, and it paves the way for further indications in that sphere towards national legislation and also international law. What we see here is a recourse to the Nuremberg trial principle, where criminals or terrorists can be held accountable on a national trial for crimes that have been perpetrated in countries abroad, for example, in Syria. So I think we will see that also in other countries, like in France, maybe in Austria to some extent. And but in practice, we also have faced several difficulties in such trials, because the evidence and the acceptance of evidence is a difficult issue for the national legislation. So you have to imagine it that way. It has to be proven that these people have committed serious crimes according to the national law standards, and it is not always very easy to bring that together with principles of international law. So it is a very important step, but we will have to see what is the practical outcome of that, and if further examples will follow. In my opinion, as I said, this is an achievement for now, and we hope that there will be a substance for further trials, because there was tremendous evidence on war crimes and terrorist attacks against civilians and innocent people everywhere in the so-called caliphate. So we have to see the dimension that approximately 6,000 European citizens were committing crimes in Syria and in Iraq, and the legislation there is not very, how should I say, strong on that, and this means that we have to take the responsibility and to prosecute that. And the German example could be some sort of a role model for further European legislation. And this is my hope, actually.
I have a couple of follow-up questions on that. Why do you think it took so long for any court in the West, in Europe, to claim a universal jurisdiction? And do you think this will serve as a form of stopping other terrorists from trying to hide in Europe and escape their crimes? So this will serve in stopping further terrorists from coming to Europe?
There are many dimensions on that. One, most importantly, I think it's about holding people accountable for what they have done abroad, and taking into consideration that these people have a German citizenship. It means that German courts are responsible for persecuting these cases. In the past, it has been difficult for reasons of bilateral international law, how should I say, contracts between the states. And we touch upon a sphere here that is a bilateral issue, and it how should I say, inflicts territorial sovereignty of states, because usually the country where it has taken place is first responsible, and it's some sort of transcends this responsibility, and European courts usually have a strong responsibility on leaving national sovereignty untouched, especially in legislation, and therefore I think we are facing here something quite new. Coming back to your question on the returning foreign terrorist fighters, definitely this will have an impact. It could also have an impact that we don't expect. For example, that these people could leave those countries, escape, going back to other theaters of war, as I call it. And on the other hand, it could also have the effect that these people could immerse into their national security environment in those countries where they were coming back to. So we have to closely observe what will happen next. But definitely it is a serious issue, and I think this is the right time to tackle that.
So, in your opinion, this was an important precedent set by the court in Koblenz, which might also help the fight against terrorism internationally. Let me move on to a recently published paper, which you published together with Professor Stefan Goertz. The topic of the paper was Opponents to the Corona Measures, Recent Actors, Ideological Elements, and Their Stochastic Potential for Violence. I translated the paper's title from the German original. I would like to turn to a discussion of the radicalization of COVID demonstrations. In demonstrations in Vienna and other major European cities throughout the pandemic, anti-vaxxers, right-wing extremists, which included supporters of QAnon, maybe even Antifa, and other conspiracy theory supporters, have voiced their opposition to COVID-19 vaccinations and restrictions, as well as demonstrating against the government. What are the main motivations of these groups taking part in these anti-COVID protests? Have these motivations changed throughout the pandemic? And have the groups demonstrating changed?
What we are observing currently is a strange mixture, some sort of a heterogeneous constellation. We have, as you just mentioned, many different groups coming together on a single issue, and the motivations are different standing behind these articulations. So we have to be very careful in distinguishing what are the groups, what are their intentions, what are their strategies. And there are conspiracy theories right next to fully fledged right-wing extremists. There are what we call Staatsverweigerer. So this is a very strange group, very typical for Germany and Austria, who refuse the governmental laws and the the state by itself. And when all those groups are coming together, we have a strange dynamic which enforces the radicalization, which is a melting pot of extremism, as I would call it. And states have a certain difficulty in reacting properly, because when they enforce their laws against right-wing extremists, it's a different thing than enforcing the law to some conspiracy theorists and people who are, just anti-vaxxers for the sake of it and without any further political background. So the whole structure is very fascinating on the one hand, but also hard to differentiate, and that makes the whole scheme and the whole scenery difficult. And especially in Germany and in Austria, we have observed, I would say, violence, also hidden violence, extremists affecting regular crowds on the street. We have seen hooligans shuffling in, throwing Molotov cocktails on police forces, burning police cars. It was a riot scene with right-wing extremists in the back, using anti-Semitic symbols, and it's really hard to get this all together in a coherent picture. But what we see is that from the very beginning, it was just against the measures of lockouts and other restrictions. But now it's about in Austria in particular, about the obligatory vaccination that will start from the beginning of March. So actually from the beginning of February, but it will be enforced from the beginning of March. So this is something else. And now they have the feeling, the legitimacy of countering the law, and they deem it as unjust, and therefore they have this sense of revenge, and they feel that they're, and this concerns the whole sphere of protesters, that they have the sense that this state is inflicting something unjust on them, and they have to fight against that. And extremism has, in usual patterns, three different stages. The first is the passive extremism, where it's just about resisting passively and agreeing with countermeasures. The second sphere is the activist extremism, where we are observing actions against the state which are mostly non-violent. And the third level, and the transitions are very smooth here, is violent extremism. And we have now observed a lot of radicalization between the second and the third stage.
You mentioned in your paper that the way these groups define themselves is, for instance, it's us against them, it's us down here against them up there. But drawing these lines is very difficult, and as you just mentioned, this promotes violence, and also the violence seems to be increasing as the pandemic is continuing. So will this spiral of violence and increasing radicalization, in your opinion, continue? And where will this end? And what do you think is the reason for this escalation in violence?
As I mentioned, we are observing a friend-foe scheme, antagonization of opinions, and there is no gray zone. There is only black and white, and this polarization is leading to something I call the erosion of cohesion, which means that we have this radicalization on the extreme ends of both sides of the ideological scheme. That means we will further see that the middle, as we call it in the German in German words, is eroding. So that there will be a radicalization towards the extremes, and this could further lead to more violence, and not only active but also passively, when more and more people will accept riots and will accept violence against police forces, or we also observed violence against doctors that do vaccinations, and against media representatives. So this will continue, and I fear it might end up in a very different scheme where this extremism will be channelized into a new agenda, and they will find one, definitely.
And when you say a new agenda, are you also referring to the political party? And in our case, it is the Austrian Freedom Party, in German, the FPÖ, which of course is using these demonstrations in Austria. And I guess in Germany, maybe you could say the AfD is similarly using them as a platform to gain support and get a political message across. So do you see these radicalizations being used by certain people?
Definitely. Those parties you just mentioned are the forefront on the, I would say, propaganda platform of the whole protest scene, and they are using their social network channels. They're using their party organization. They're using the whole structure to proceed with that, and they think that they might gain new and recruit new people following them by such measures. And this topic is perfectly tailored for their opposition against the state. So they accuse the state of being of taking away the freedom from the individual. They are accusing the state of forcing people into vaccination. They are accusing the state of inflicting not useful, not efficient measures on the population. And this will be taken up by everyday people. It's not just an issue of extremists. So we in Austria, we think that there's a percentage of approximately 25 to 30%, the potential of people who could sympathize with this rhetoric and ideology.
So that's actually a very scary perspective. If you say 25 to 30% will be sympathetic towards this ideology. And when you say ideology, I'm not condemning the entire Freedom Party as such. I'm condemning those who are moving towards the right end of it, and especially those who you mentioned are using this, and maybe also these anti-Semitic symbolisms, which have now crept up more and more in these demonstrations. Should the government be doing more? Should the police be doing more? Should these demonstrations, in your opinion, should something else be happening to stop these radicalizations? Can something else be done?
I think one major tool is de-escalation, because once you take out the explosive forces out of the conglomerate, you achieve a lot, and you have to separate the extremists from the regular protesters, because protest is a democratic right, and we have to accept that, and we have to live with that. And this is something normal. It happens everywhere in democracies all over the world. But the problem is when extremist forces and populist parties step on this trailer and ride the game on their own and try to profit from the whole situation. And this is what's going to happen also in the near future. We have seen this in the past month, and I don't see any reason to doubt that this is going to continue.
So that's actually a somewhat scary prospect moving forward, even past the pandemic. I'd like to discuss now the role of the social media, which has played in these demonstrations. The demonstrations, which are often labeled as walks organize themselves via social media. The communication platform of choice seems to be Telegram. On Telegram, users set up groups and chat and channels and broadcast messages. So in your opinion, as an expert in extremism, what do you believe is the responsibility of the social media in these demonstrations? And does social media have a role in terrorism and criminal activity, and should it be more regulated?
Definitely. We are now entering I would say, the third decade of terrorism and extremism, and what we are observing is the virtualization of the whole scheme. So we've seen in the past the entire value chain from first contact with ideology to the plotting of terrorist attacks online, and social media are a carrier of the whole development. So this means social media platforms like Telegram and others are a useful tool for extremists, and they are able to reach a lot of people with those means. They are able to deliver messages directly to the people. What we also see is that media are not, I would say, standard media and official media. They have a certain crisis in confidence. Here, people do not trust these media anymore. They think what they are going to be delivered by social media and other channels is the truth. We have seen this in the United States in the course of the January 6th riot, Capitol storm as well. So they have a filter-based, channelized truth. And this is the role of these social media. And in fact, it is very difficult for the state apparatus and the police forces, the intelligence forces to tackle that, because, for example, Telegram is the responsible structures are located in Russia. And we know, given the current political situation, it is even worse to address such issues to those groups. And they say, they argue that their structure is also for opposition of dictatorial regimes everywhere in the world. And so you have a hard time. You have to prove with strong evidence that their platforms are misused by extremist groups. It happens sometimes. There have been some cases of success in the past, but I think it's even more difficult now.
I have two follow-up questions regarding this. So it's a certain dilemma that the West sees itself in that these terrorists and extremists are using the freedoms which the West provides, and also the freedom of the internet, actually to undermine those freedoms themselves. Which brings me then to my second question. So these social media, big tech organizations have so much power nowadays. What can be done, and it probably would have to be done in a regulatory framework, so that these social media organizations, either on their own or through government regulation, really have strict rules to censoring, but not censoring in the sense from blocking out information, but from really filtering out these terrorist and criminal activities. Because what you don't want people not to be able to voice their opinion. So you don't want censorship as such, but you would like terrorist and criminal activity to be taken off the web. What, in your opinion, would be the easiest way or the best way to tackle this very important issue?
Actually, initiatives already exist. Or there are also contracts and agreements with huge social media platforms like Google and the Meta, which was formerly Facebook, concerned. But and it works with them. But what we observe is that extremists and radicalized groups, they jump to new platforms. Right now, and also in the past for jihadists, it was Telegram, and also right now for the right-wing protesters, it is still Telegram. There is 4chan, 8chan, other platforms, so the possibilities are very open, and you have a lot of choices here. So this makes the whole game much more difficult. In my opinion, a proper way is infiltrating that, which also happens, but it's also hard to identify those channels immediately. Yeah, and some channels are protected by political parties, as the one you mentioned before. So whenever somebody communicates over those channels, you have a hard time, and you have to prove with very strong evidence that extremists use their platforms. And until that moment, you can prove it substantially. This will go on, and you have a very low chance to change the situation.
So that means that terrorist and criminal activity probably will continue to use the freedom of the internet to undermine the freedoms of the societies they live in. Is that a correct statement in your opinion?
This is definitely a correct statement. And what we also observe is that we'll see some sort of a coding in that area. That means those people deliberately use codes. They don't pronounce it literally, but the addressees, they know what it means. So it has become more complex, and you need to have specialists in the departments of constitutional protection and also in the intelligence sphere to filter out those people, to filter out those channels. And they have hidden ways of communicating. In the past years, there has been evidence about extremists communicating over console platforms, for example, PlayStations or Xboxes. There have been what we call Internet of Things devices, where they have sent through Alexa and other devices their messages. So the fantasy is not restricted, and what we definitely know is that extremists very easily find out about subversion and means of circumventing these usual channels. So my opinion is that we will have to invest a lot more of money into qualified technicians, IT specialists, and to stick them together with experts on extremism in order to tackle that. And in the past, there has been some success in the sphere of jihadist violence. It was possible to infiltrate some of those channels. It was possible to cut down some of these channels, but still it exists, and propaganda exists, and communication exists, and this will go on.
So following to the next topic, which is also related to using the internet as a platform for communication and disseminating messages between terrorist and extremist groups, it's the whole idea of cyber terrorism, which is always in the news and has been in the news of late. Cyber terrorism involves the use of computers and a related technology with the intention of causing harm or damage in order to coerce a civilian population and influence policy or a targeted government or otherwise affect its conduct. Furthermore, cyber terrorism can be used to hack critical infrastructure, for instance, which also has been in the news. There has been initiatives on the EU level, such as the EU Cybersecurity Act, which entered into force in 2019. And in December 2020, we had the European Commission and the European External Action Service, which presented the EU cybersecurity strategy. On March 22nd, 2021, the Council adopted conclusions on the cybersecurity strategy, underlying that cybersecurity is essential for building a resilient, green, and digital Europe. What should governments and the EU do to prepare for cyber threats, and where And from whom are the major cyber threats coming from these days?
I have attended a lot of conferences dealing also with those issues. The leading experts in the field come from Israel, in my opinion, currently. And they always tell us, the Europeans, that we should invest into resilience, to make our systems fit, to defend ourselves against potential attacks, to prepare our weakest points, to enforce them, to make them stronger. And this is one major aspect. The aspect of what you just described concerning those political intentions, strategies, papers. This is also very useful, but only until the very point when it has to be executed. And as far as I have observed it in the past, the execution of those guidelines, of those laws, is very difficult, in particular in the sphere of cyber crime, cyber terrorism, cyber war. And the major I would say actors, major players in that field are state actors. So this is what we observed in the past 2 or 3 years. There was a major incident in the beginning of 2020 against the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a cyber attack, which has been regarded as an act of cyber terrorism. What we know by now that this was directed via a Russian cell, which has obviously some ties to the Russian government or intelligence bodies. China has always appeared on the sphere, and so far terrorist organizations, what we know, they have not been able to that extent to put some leverage into the sphere of cyber terrorism to the extent they wanted, at least. So for the time being, we have to concentrate on those state actors that have tremendously invested into their cyber capabilities. And what we've seen in Ukraine in 2014, when you remember those green soldiers, we also see those green soldiers in the sphere of cyber. So it is very difficult here to identify who was the originator of such attacks. And it is also even more difficult to react properly and to put those on trial or to investigate even. So this will give the European governments a hard time for the future. And I have the sincere hope that they will follow the Israeli recommendation and to make their systems more resilient, because this is the only proper way of defending their interests, of defending their critical infrastructure, of defending the people in the very end. And anything else is possible, but it takes time to build up the capabilities.
When you mentioned Israel, isn't this powerful program by the name of Pegasus, doesn't that also come from Israel? And the implications of such a program, which I believe can just spy on every part of your existence once it infiltrates, do you recommend that governments should actively purchase and become part of this Pegasus movement, or is this a dangerous movement also regarding data protection and data security?
It is both. It's a twofold thing. As you said, you have the huge chance of investigating criminal and extremist activity. It makes sense to have something like that from that perspective. But on the other perspective, imagining that governments have such a powerful tool in their hands, the risk of exploitation and reducing freedom is quite high. So my suggestion is to find a way of implementing similar technologies, but being careful about the compliance with data regulatory restrictions. So I don't think that this is quite realistic at the moment, but it will be possible that it might turn out in such a way in the future.
But it is a very scary prospect for the future with the face recognition software which exists and which is being implemented by many countries, not only China, but for instance, in Great Britain, I think face recognition software is widely being used. And if you couple that with a program like Pegasus, which can basically follow your every move, then your privacy is more or less a thing of the past. And I think the Europeans are always walking this thin line, but if they really believe in what we stand for, namely that the individual has certain rights and those rights also mean that your privacy rights are protected, how would this be able to be put underneath one cap, so to speak, if we use these modern technologies, which might be actually very effective in fighting crime, terrorism, and extremism? So how does one walk that fine line?
It's always a question of balancing. So we have to properly assess the scale of the threat and to weigh this against the restriction of freedom. And this is a very simple equation. And once we consider the threat reaching a certain level, then we might think of reducing freedom for the sake of protecting the people. And when it comes to terrorism and extremist violence, fortunately, in Europe, we haven't yet reached such a level where I would say that it is necessary to restrict on our liberties in such a dimension that as you described it. So for the time being, we are on a I would say on a safer way, limiting our capabilities just to that level, what is necessary to tackle the challenges. And when we reach, and I don't hope so that this will happen, sometimes a level of states like Israel or the United States in the post 9/11 era, we could think of other measures. But putting the focus on Austria and Germany, I think that those technologies and surveillance practices in place are sufficient.
You mean those that are currently being used in Europe at the moment without any further technology improvements? Or if that is an improvement, I'm not sure it's an improvement, but advances in the sense of more capability.
Yes, but as with many other things, it's just about how we are using that. Yeah, potentially these technologies may do much more than they are currently being used for, and I think this is the European way of dealing with that. We use it to the appropriate scale, and we have done very well in that regard in the past years in this regard, and so I wouldn't recommend to further that. And once we think, as I said, we have a threat scenario like in Israel, then who knows? It might be necessary. I think it's just the way how we handle it. It comes down to that very simple thing on the very end.
So I hope your prognosis proves correct that Europe will uphold its data protection standards moving forward into the future. Let me turn to my last group of questions, which has to do with the horrible Vienna terrorist attack, which happened on the 2nd of November of 2020. That was the scene of the worst terrorist attack ever to hit Austria. 4 people were killed and dozens were injured. The attacker was a 25-year-old Chechen who was killed at the scene of the crime. And it turned out that he was an ISIL sympathizer, which they also confirmed one day after it occurred. In August 2020, prosecution against some of his collaborators was commenced in Vienna. So my question to you is, how great is the danger such sleeper cells or of such unknown groups, which then suddenly pop out of nowhere, it seems, committing terrorist acts in Austria or in Europe? And can you estimate how many sleeper cells exist in Austria and in Europe? And what can our society do to counter this threat?
One short correction at the beginning: it was Northern Macedonia, not Chechnya, the perpetrator of the Vienna attack.
Exactly.
Yes, sleeper cells. I should start from scratch here. Austria has in the past had always a quite well-established Islamist scene here, and in proportion, Austria has produced some 330 foreign terrorist fighters heading to the so-called caliphate in Syria and in Iraq, which is in the European comparison related to the size of population of Austria, the fourth place. This has a strong meaning. We have this proximity to the Balkans. We have a lot of influx of jihadists from the Balkans. We had a lot of preachers like Abu Tema with a strong relation to the Balkans. We have this, as you mentioned, I think the second largest Chechnyan population in exile in Austria. A lot of, at least 50% of those people heading to Syria were of Chechnyan origin, which is hard to statistically prove, but from certain sources, this is very well confirmed because they are registered as Russian citizens. So this is the two major scenes in the Islamist sphere in Austria, with others emerging. And yes, there has been sort of infiltration here. There are some cells which are closely observed by our newly formatted DSN, which is the following institution of the BVD. This is the National Security Intelligence Service, and they are well aware of this group. In fact, it comes down to some dozens of people who are considered to be a threat to Austrian security. What is more important, in my opinion, is to cut off the stream of radicalization for new forces. And my colleague in Israel, Boaz Ganor, always says that terrorism is an issue of the second generation of immigrants. And considering the 2015 migration flow towards Austria, with at least 100,000 persons coming in from war regions, even from Afghanistan, this may cause a new threat in the future, and we have to prevent them from radicalization. And this is our major task at the moment. I think in the long run, this is the serious problem, and not these people here. It might happen that there will be another terrorist attack in the near future in Austria. It might happen anywhere else. You can reduce this risk only to a certain extent, and in particular in the sphere of homegrown terrorism, of people who have not been on the scene, who have not been recognized as jihadists, for example. They may have a very spontaneous idea, commit an act of terrorism inspired by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or any other organization, and people going out on the street and stabbing other people with a knife or using an axe or using a car, you can hardly prevent that from happening. And this is something we have to be aware of. And this is a regular risk, but in our rationality, this makes out a very, very limited part of the risks we are currently facing. So my students, I always tell them the risk of getting hit by a brick stone falling down from a roof is much higher statistically than becoming a victim of a terrorist attack. And in the case of the Viennese attack of 2nd November 2020, we have seen that fortunately this has only caused 4 casualties and some 20 injured. It could have been much, much, much worse, considering the weapon he used, considering the situation with a lot of people being around. And it was mainly because the perpetrator was quite a dilettante in plotting and in carrying out this attack. So we have generally observed this all over Europe. And I think this kind of low-level attacks and also the stochastic attacks will continue. And the security bodies are mainly responsible in foiling attacks carried out by cells, by groups. And these are under close surveillance, I should say. And only in exceptional cases, like it unfortunately happened in the Viennese case, because from what we know now, in the background, there has been a lot of transnational activity, a network with Germany and Switzerland, and there have been certain ties, and there was some evidence before the attack, and if this had been investigated properly, maybe this could have been avoided. But I don't think that a terrorist attack in the long run could have been avoided, because if our security forces had taken out this perpetrator beforehand, someone else could have done it at a later time. So I think there is sort of how should I say it, inevitability in that.
So you say some attack was inevitable, considering the amount of danger that maybe exists with the influx coming from these war areas to Europe, and that there do exist a certain amount of sleeper cells which are still willing to commit crimes. As you already mentioned, there was an investigation commission headed by the criminal lawyer Ingeborg Zerbes, which, as you already mentioned, came to the conclusion, which were released in February 2021, that there were failures prior to the attack, especially on the part of the Austrian State Security Service, or BVT. And as a result of that, the BVT was restructured, and it was also with the support of the opposition parties. So the SPÖ and the Freedom Party also agreed on this reform. Could you maybe tell us what this new reform, because now it has been divided between the State Security Service on the one hand and the Secret Service on the other hand, how does this new structure of the BVT, which used to incorporate both of these functions, how will this help in fighting terrorism moving forward? And what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, my opinion is rather positive on this, because this is a standard that is internationally compliant, and there had been some discussions long ago to move on in that direction, and due to the terrorist attack, I would say the drive was renewed, and finally they agreed on a solution. And for example, in the past, if the investigators found out evidence on some I would say in a criminal law case, they were obliged to officially announce that and to start a legal investigation. And this is very difficult in the sphere of intelligence, because people working in the intelligence business, they are running after much more sophisticated threats, and they cannot always stop at a certain level when they found some evidence for example, the the purchase of a gun, which is just one trace leading to the final point. Yeah, and so they have now established a structure where it's possible to do both things and to still follow up on the regular intelligence work. And this is a major advantage now, and I think this will turn out very well. There were some other things implemented, on, for example, a new attorney, especially in charge of terrorist cases. There was a new legislation in the Austrian criminal law, Strafgesetzbuch. So there were some, I would say, reforms established now, and my opinion on that is it always depends on the people doing it on the field. So the prerequisites are there. It's now their task to do it. And as this was just founded in December 21, we have to give them time to establish that. But one thing is evident, that they are working hard to gain the trust of their international partners, because that's what it's all about. It's cooperation, coordination, and communication, the 3 C's. And this is intelligence work. And we've seen that in all 3 fields there were major drawbacks in the 4th field of the terrorist attack of Vienna. And I also had the opportunity of stating my opinion to the decision makers there. And I have the personal feeling that they are taking this seriously, and they are working hard to improve on that.
And my final question to you, which you already alluded to, that successful fight against terrorism has to also happen on an international level. So one has to take more of a bird's eye view. So moving now from the Austrian theater to the international theater, what, in your opinion, needs to be done with cooperation on EU level, on an international level? Because terrorists and cyber terrorists, they're communicating with each other very effectively, it seems. And somehow it seems like the national and international government actors are sometimes one step behind. So how can that change in the future?
This is a very important issue, but also very difficult. And I tell you why. There is a long-hold proposition that counterterrorism is a national security issue, and it's about secrets, and you don't share those secrets, or do you just share it for some other information? It's a deal making, and you know, in the past there has been a lot of hints and communications, but when it comes down to the very end, it's everyone is doing his own business, and this is a long-grown structure. I think that the attempts to internationalize this cooperation are very, very important, because, as Stanley McChrystal said, it takes a network to defeat a network, and this network has to be spawned internationally. And this is what's happening. There are some formats where this cooperation is working, but to understand counterterrorism, there is Boaz Ganor's, the Israeli counterterrorism expert, equation. You have to limit the motivation of the terrorists, and you have to fight the capabilities. If you manage to tackle one successfully of those, there will be no terrorist attack. And so on the motivational scale, this is what I just explained, this prevention, de-radicalization, to kick off the motivation, to also to withdraw from international conflicts when you have no business there, because in the most of the justifications of terrorists, they always alluded to this conflict terror nexus. They said they were attacking here because the Kafar, the infidels, were invading as crusaders Iraq and somewhere else. So leaving this theater has also an implication on terrorist activity here. And capabilities is just the hard work of counterterrorism. Security forces, intelligence to kick away their legs on the field and to make it impossible for them to carry out an attack. So international cooperation has to focus on these two elements.
Thank you very much